Harrington, my Chief of Staff, to come forward to begin the presentation regarding an update on the Pulse Museum. There have been recent developments, as many of you have seen in the local media, and we wanted to provide an update to the board today with the status of our contractual relationship with the Pulse, One Pulse Foundation. With that, Ms. Harrington, you're recognized at this time.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, Comptroller Diamond. I'm here this morning along with Whitney Evers, Senior Assistant County Attorney, to give you an update on the Pulse Museum. Our presentation outline this morning will start with the purpose. I'll cover the background, and then Whitney will cover the Pulse Museum TDD funding agreement, current status, and next steps. Just as a reminder, the purpose of the discussion this morning is to update the board on the Pulse Museum, the associated tourist development tax funding agreement, and next steps. So for some background, the Pulse nightclub tragedy occurred on June 12, 2016. On July 7, 2016, the One Pulse Foundation was established and received its 501c3 determination letter. September 21st, 2018, the Tourist Development Council approved the Pulse Museum funding of up to $10 million from excess tourist development tax revenues for land acquisition and design fees. And on October 30th, 2018, the Board of County Commissioners approved the Pulse Museum funding of up to $10 million from excess tourist development tax revenues for land acquisition and design fees. This is, and on September 13, 2019, the foundation purchased 1.7-acre parcel of land at 438 West Cayley Street, in Orlando, for $3.5 million. And this is an overview of where that property is. It's on the corner of Cayley and Division, and you can see the building on the right-hand side. On October 29, 2019, the foundation received a $500,000 State of Florida Department of State Cultural Facilities grant for the Pulse National Museum, Memorial and Museum to cover costs associated with constructing museum. The agreement has been amended 2 times, on August 19, 2020, and again on May 18, 2023. To date, approximately $400,000 has been drawn down from that grant. On October 30th, 2019, the foundation announced the winning design team for the National Pulse Memorial and Museum, and this is just the renderings from that competition. And on October 27, 2023, the foundation notified the county they would be not able to proceed with constructing the museum. To date, the foundation has spent $6.5 million of the TDT funds on land acquisition and design fees. Now I'm going to turn things over to Whitney Evers.
Thank you, Roseanne. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners, Comptroller Diamond, Mr. Brooks. As Roseanne said, I'm going to start off with, the TDT funding agreement. I wanted to talk to you about a couple of provisions in there, starting with some of the funding agreement restrictions. Under the agreement, the funding was to be used solely to pay the cost of acquisition of the museum property and for design costs for the museum. Under the terms of the agreement, the design costs individually were capped at $4.5 million. The property acquisition was capped at $7 million, with the total not to exceed $10 million in the county contribution. The agreement also said that the foundation was prohibited from using any part of that county contribution for salaries, compensation, overhead, or administrative costs. There were some requirements in the funding agreement. Specifically, the foundation was to diligently proceed with fundraising efforts and the design, construction, and operation of the museum. They were to use the property solely as a museum open to the public as contemplated by the TDT statute. And they were also required to provide quarterly reports to the county administrator and comptroller on compliance with the agreement, as well as their fundraising, design, and construction. And as I understand it, that did happen. Under the agreement, the foundation agreed to allow for audits and inspections by the county and the comptroller and to use generally accepted accounting principles in its record keeping. They also agreed to indemnify the county for any negligent acts or omissions of the foundation, its staff, or directors, and to provide the county and the comptroller with audited financial statements and IRS Form 990 filings. Those are their 501c3 filings with the IRS. The agreement also required that restrictive covenants be placed on the property, and those were recorded on the same day they purchased the property on September 13th of 2019. The restrictive covenants included the fact that they needed to use the property solely as a museum unless written consent from the county was obtained. They had to complete construction of the museum within 7 years. They were prohibited from selling, conveying, leasing, assigning, or transferring the property, and from creating, placing, recording, or consenting to any liens, encumbrances, leases, agreements, etc. on the property or the buildings thereon, again, without the county's written consent. And if they default on any of those restrictive covenants for more than 90 days, the agreement says the county could demand the property be returned and avail ourselves of any other legal remedies. Under the agreement, any of the following would constitute a default. If the foundation fails to comply with the restrictive covenants, they lose their 501c3 status, they vacate or abandon the property. If there was any material representation made by the foundation to induce disbursement of the county contribution, which the county later determines to be materially false, misleading, or incorrect, or if they default in performance of any of the material terms or covenants of the agreement for more than 30 days. And finally, if there is a dissolution, if they file bankruptcy, or they are insolvent, that is a default under the agreement. So, moving on to current status, where are we today? As Roseanne said, on October 27th, the foundation informed the county that they were no longer able to build the museum. They wanted us to terminate the agreement, and they offered to convey the property back to the county. On October 30th, the foundation notified the state that it was unable to complete the museum and sought to terminate that state grant agreement that Roseanne mentioned. And I want to pause here to focus on this a little bit. Under that state grant agreement, the foundation was awarded up to $500,000 for the memorial and the museum. In order to get those funds, they were required to provide either a surety bond or record restrictive covenants on the property. At the time, the county agreed to allow them to record restrictive covenants on the museum property. Those restrictive covenants require that the funds from that state grant be used for a cultural facility, which is defined in state statute as anything involving music, dance, art, photography, museums, etc. And that it needed to be used as a cultural facility within 10 years of entering into the grant agreement. So that happened in 2019. That means there needs to be a cultural facility there sometime before 2029. If that doesn't happen, the restrictive covenants require that those state grant funds be repaid. And that obligation, because it is a restrictive covenant and recorded in the chain of title, runs with the property and is binding on any successors in interest, meaning that if that is not resolved before the property is conveyed back to the county could be on the hook to repay that obligation. And as Roseanne mentioned, we believe they've drawn down approximately $400,000 of that state grant. On November 7th, the county received copies of multiple license agreements that the foundation had executed on the museum property without county consent. There are 4 license agreements, one of which the county agreed to. It was for a portion of the parking lot. We agreed to that initially on the closing of the property. The other 3 license agreements are for the use of the building itself and for the remainder of the parking lot. As a result of that, on November 21st, we notified the foundation that they were in default. We asked them to terminate those license agreements within 60 days and to keep the property insured until it was conveyed back to the county. As part of that default letter, we also asked them to provide copies of their financial documents as well as proof of the TDT funds that were spent on those design requisition costs and copies of all their board meeting minutes as well. So where do we go from here? First of all, we are looking to receive the foundation financials and those board meeting minutes. Comptroller's office will be taking the lead on that. Again, we asked for copies of bank statements with canceled checks for all the TDT funds received pursuant to design cost requisitions. And just for your information, under the agreement, we did not just give the foundation $10 million. We required them to provide us with those design cost requisitions and any requisition for the property acquisition. And as we received those, they were reviewed and they were paid out. We also asked for the most recent statement of activities and statement of financial position, including September, October, and November of this year when it's available, as well, again, as all of the board minutes for the years 2019 through and including 2023. While we are looking at that, we're going to need to do some due diligence and physical inspections of the property itself at the 438 West Cayley Street. Real estate management will take the lead on that with capital projects, risk management, and facilities in a supporting role. As I said, the property has been licensed out to what we understand to be a furniture fabricator, so we don't know what has been occurring inside the property itself, whether there are chemicals or anything else that has happened. As a result of that, we'll need to do an environmental site assessment. We're also going to need to do a title review, an appraisal, and get some inspections of the facility before we convey it back to the county. Lastly, we're going to have to develop a termination agreement, which will memorialize the terms and the timing of the conveyance. Our office will be working on that. Real estate management will be supporting. We'll need to draft that agreement. We'll need to draft the closing documents. And all of these things are going to be happening simultaneously, hopefully, but unfortunately not quickly. Our best estimate is that this will take probably a minimum of 3 months to come back to you all with this agreement, simply because doing the inspections, the walkthrough, all of those things is going to take some time. With that, we are available for questions. We've got several members of staff here. I understand we have some folks from the foundation as well.
All right. It is definitely unfortunate that as a community we find ourselves in the relative position that we are now with the likely dissolution of the One Pulse Foundation, and that means that the museum will not go forward. There is still a lot of uncertainty about the memorial site, and the city of Orlando is obviously taking the lead in that. Having said that, I do recognize that we do have members present from the One Pulse Foundation, and perhaps it would be appropriate at this time if any one of you would like to come forward and make any comments. I will invite you to do that. It's not required. I'm just simply extending the invitation to you if you would like to share any thoughts or comments.
Good morning. My name is George Kalagridis, and I am the vice chair of the One Pulse Foundation. So I think, like all of us in this room, we were impacted by the terrible tragedy. And like all nonprofits, in most cases, it's a group of citizens who come together who want to do something good for the community. And that's exactly what our board did. At the time, I think, intensity of anger and sadness and frustration was so great in the community that as we developed plans, we had immense support. And we took advantage, as most nonprofits do, when, in the case of Orange County, there was a window of time where there were surplus TDD funds. We applied with a grant and we received it. It was for the museum. And so we had a time frame. We set out, I think did an amazing job of making sure that we spent time in other cities where these tragedies had taken place to understand what worked, what didn't work, what backfired. We involved families, survivors, first responders, government officials. We brought in somebody who had done a competition in New York to make sure that the process was fair. And then we had a competition. Mayor, you were on the jury, and we chose a design. At the same time, what we were finding out, because you have in something like this parallel processes. So we have a design team and the design and construction committee. There are few cities that have the talent that Orlando does because of our theme park. So we had people from Disney, people who had built many attractions. So the financial and fiscal accountability was there, value engineering. We weren't wasting money. Our percent of spend from design fees as compared to the national average was right in line. But on the development side, revenue, what we were starting to find out was that people, corporations in particular, had very little interest in donating toward a memorial and just as little toward a museum, which meant that we were going to have to try to find individual funds. And so we're doing that at the same time COVID hits. And by then, the cost had risen to something that was just, clearly not acceptable. So we value engineered the process, and all of this is taking time and all taking place with volunteers. There are 9 people on the staff. So everybody that's doing all of this work, and you need professionals to do this, also have day jobs. And so things just, by the time they got to a point where we felt like we had the right project, something that we could afford, the development team tried to start raising money, and then we had the issues on the other side where the property owners of the site, it got caught up in the media, and unfortunately, the revenues weren't there. And so that's where we are today. But your project, the one that you funded, I feel very proud that the process was accurate. We had the right eyes on costs, on everything that you could possibly plan for. We did a good job, I think. So, and I'm very sorry, as all of us are, that it's not going to happen because it would have been an amazing project.
Okay.
Good morning, Commissioners, Mayor.
Morning.
Thank you very much for allowing us the opportunity to come before you. And first of all, to thank you for trust and for giving us the opportunity to have explored an ideal. And we are, as George just mentioned, probably more victims of unexplained and unexpected consequences when we have a pandemic and a situation of reduced charitable giving for something that was as ambitious and as bold and daring as what we wanted to have. But yet today, we are here still saddened but hopeful because we see that the community is still determined to make things work properly, to not allow hate to win. You are still in the process of seeking, and we are all seeking the opportunity to continue our work, which was a work of changing behaviors, of modifying the way we think about one another and the way we treat one another. At the core value proposition of the One Pulse Foundation, that is what we were seeking to do. And that is what we are still hopeful that the community will continue that effort. If it's not brick and mortar, buildings happen, but a movement such as the one that was started by all of you after the tragedy is not just based on brick and mortar. It will continue, and we appreciate your kindness and your consideration.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your willingness to come forward and make some statements. I didn't want to ignore the fact that you're here. This has been a collaborative effort within our community to try to honor those persons who sadly were tragically killed during the events of June the 12th, 2016. And it continues to be quite an emotional event for the families and our community in general. However, as a county, we do have to do our due diligence because of the contractual relationship that we had with the expenditure of the people's money. And going forward, given the dissolution that is underway, there are some contractual things that have to take place on the business side of what we do with our relationship, and we'll move forward with that. There's been, some concern by different members of our community, family members and others, about the expenditure of funds, the overall management of those funds, and because there were county dollars involved, it has involved our elected controller, who essentially is the person who cuts the checks on behalf of any direction that the Board of County Commission gives, and historically he has done that. I'm going to ask the controller at this time if he would like to speak because I do realize that part of the next steps, there were some things indicated that the Orange County Controller would be involved in, but for clarity for members of the public, Mr. Diamond, if you would kind of opine on what you see your role is going forward, because I know some members of our community have asked that an audit be done of the One Pulse Foundation, and that may not be your role, but it may be your role to review the expenditure of other items and somewhat an audit of any expenditures made by the county. So I would ask that rather than me put words in your mouth, perhaps you should speak at this time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. And I think before I talk at all about my office's role, I also want just to acknowledge the ultimate sadness that I think all of us feel. I think everybody in this room remembers well 7.5 years ago, the night that the tragedy occurred. I mean, I'll never forget the sound of the helicopters. That's the most personal thing to me. And then the just god-awful reports that we heard over the following days and weeks and months, and the long road we've all taken to be here today. You didn't mention it, Mayor, but I think it deserves mentioning that you were the sheriff at that time. And I can only imagine the perspective that gave you. But just to talk about what we're doing with this process, we are working with Ms. Evers' team. My former director of audit, current assistant comptroller for finance, is on that task force, and by all accounts, they're doing a very thorough job under Ms. Evers' leadership. So, number one, we did ask for certain documents to be provided. Why? Well, we'd like to see, with the lien that the state has on the property now, are there funds, are there resources that we can use to satisfy that lien so the county's property wouldn't be subject to that lien? In other words, it's like a mortgage that people might have on their houses, and when you sell your house and it has a mortgage on it, somebody has to pay the mortgage because the buyer doesn't want your mortgage. And it's very similar to that, I think. So we're going to be looking at that. We'll be looking at records in that way, just to see if there are sources of funding, resources available to protect the county from that lien. Number two, Mayor, you mentioned audit, and it's a question we've gotten over the past so many weeks. And what I'd say about that is, number one, the agreement with the county did give us authority at least to audit the amounts the county provided under the agreement. And, you know, we also looked at, with that in mind, we looked at, well, how much was that? Well, it was about $6.5 million, and that's $6.5 million out of about $20 million or so that the Pulse Foundation received over its existence. As far as the $6.5 million, what I would tell the board is, first of all, the largest piece of that was $3.5 million for the purchase of that property. And we looked at that purchase, and by all accounts, the purchase was done properly, and purchased a valuable piece of land, which the county will ultimately receive. The remainder of about $3 million were amounts that were submitted to the county for design costs only. It went to about 6 different, about 90% of it went to about 6 different vendors. We've looked at those receipts, and they all were for design costs. They were all approved by county staff. We'll look again at more detailed records when we do get the records from the foundation. But by all accounts, they were for design costs pursuant to the agreement. And whether or not we go any further than that remains to be seen based on what we see. So with that, that's a summary of where we are. It's not to say that as circumstances change, our role might change, but that's where we are as of now.
Thank you for being open, with, your role in this process, and you're correct. I was there on the night of the incident, or the morning of the incident, and it was an unforgettable experience for me, having a look into the eyes of the first responders, the family members, and even some of the survivors. That was an incident for our community that I pray will never, ever happen again. And because of that, everyone wanted to come together and do good to uplift these families and to ensure that the hate of a terror attack didn't win out over the love for one another and humankind. And so I do applaud these volunteers who stepped up to the plate to try to do their best to honor the commitment that our community was making. Things just simply have not occurred that we all hoped and prayed for, and we find ourselves in this relative position today. So there are questions that members of the board have at this time. I'm going to open it up to the members of the board. Those questions may be for staff or others, just so that we come together and know where we are in the process as a Board of County Commission. We'll start with Commissioner Uribe.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I want to say a lot of my questions are for staff. It's very frustrating and disappointing to be at this point here today. To the board that's here, thank you for attending. I know that your service to this board was well-intended, but what we've learned and unfolded over the course of the few weeks, almost month, that the media has also shared, it's very disappointing that such poor decisions were made along the process. And I will be honest, I'm so frustrated and hurt because this is a tragedy that took place 7.5 years ago, and it's not to blame to you all directly. I'm actually so appreciative that you came. But here we are, and what we've done is we've met families. We've met individuals who are so frustrated, have questions, are angry, are sad, and we've done nothing to support these families or memorialize their family members that have passed in this time. And I know they say hindsight is 20/20. Could we have started with something simple, a field, something to start this memorial? But what we're dealing with now is technically misuse of funds, poor decisions made on what the contract had been offered through the tourist development tax, and lastly, we still don't have a memorial and we don't have a space to call. And I hope that my colleagues on this board, as we're discussing TDT again, will join in making sure that we allocate funding to make a museum at the location that was purchased. But I do want to ask a couple of questions, Whitney, and I know we had a brief discussion yesterday, and you were very candid with me. I mean, you're just a messenger. You're a facts woman. You're running with that. But when we talk about these poor decisions where you've sent letters that individuals who've been renting the property direct violation of the contract that we had with them. Do we know how long this has been taking place?
So Commissioner, the copy of the licenses that I received, 2 of them were entered into in 2022, and the other 2 were this year.
Okay, so within the last year or so is what we can imagine. We can't find anything else prior to that.
Well, there was one prior to that we agreed to for the parking lot in 2019, so I assume that one has been re-upped. Maybe that was re-upped in 2022. I think that was one of the parking ones.
Okay, and I know Comptroller Diamond, we talked about what we paid for the property, which was around $3 million. Have we at all looked at the value and assessed what that cost would be now? Like, has that value grown over time? Because I worry about that $6 million that we discussed that we're in the hole, and how much can we get out of that? I'm also worried about the grant funding that was spent. And so just curious to know, have we looked at the value of the property and where we're going now?
Well, I know Ms. Severs said that she wanted to get an appraisal as part of the due diligence, which we think is a very good idea. As far as the property and what it might be worth, I do know that you've got across the street from there on the northeast corner, there's a mixed-use development that is in the works that should really help that area, I think. And I know the city of Orlando's had the goal of seeing that neighborhood transition from industrial to more of a retail and residential area, given its proximity to downtown. My personal feeling, as someone who lives basically down the road from there, is that it's a very nice area, and I think it has a lot of potential, and I think it's a valuable piece of land.
Great.
Commissioner, I'm
Yes.
sorry, on that front, I just wanted to let you know that Real Estate Management has done an internal cost estimate on that, an informal one at this point. That's coming back around $4.5 million, but we would need to do the official appraisals, 2 of those, to confirm that number.
Okay, and a question I'm sure many people are wondering, and I'm wondering, has anyone ever looked into the nonprofit? Have we investigated? Over the course of weeks, we've seen $18 million spent on salary and compensation and all these things. Have we looked at this nonprofit? Has the state looked at this nonprofit? Have we internally looked at this nonprofit to see its validity? Because at the same time, we've seen the executive director resign, we've seen folks off the board resign, and there's a lot of questions. I don't know how much is factual about board members getting paid, the exorbitant amount of fees, salaries, compensation. I know that there was a comment that there were 8 employees that were paid. Has anyone, or is a state attorney or anyone one thing I hear consistently is what's happened to the money? Where did the money go? Where did the money go? And I think that while you guys are asking for appropriate documentation, I think I want to know, where did all that money go? That is a lot of money that has gone away year after year, and we're just looking at their 1099s and things like that that are very simplified. They're not in detail. But that's concerning because there was clearly income coming in too, but there was outgoing tremendously, way more than what was coming in. And when you talk about a nonprofit, you really want to say, is anyone investigating this nonprofit as a whole?
So Commissioner, I can't speak to the state. I don't know of anything that they have done at this point. At least no one's told me about that. For the county internally, we have not investigated per se the nonprofit. As I mentioned, when we asked for the documentation, part of what we're trying to do there is help to answer that question, which is, where did the money go? How much were they bringing in? How much is left? So that's what we're doing at this point. Under the agreement, the foundation was required to abide by all of the appropriate rules, laws, and regulations for the 501c3 and their corporate structure. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Comptroller, but we have been getting quarterly reports and we have been getting the updates that were required under the agreement, so presumably they have been maintaining that structure. I don't know, though. I haven't seen that documentation yet.
Yeah, because like most, which brings me to the point, like most things in government, there's a process. You file your paperwork. Doesn't mean that they investigate, doesn't mean that they've checked that it's accurate. Because I know, I feel like I'm repeating myself, I think it was about 3 years ago, when, and this is completely off subject, when we were talking about the Tangelo Community Center that was run by the YMCA, like, did we check our own property? Did we know that there was a violation of the contract? How much teeth do we have in our agreement with tourist development tax to really not only just release them from this, but what comes behind that agreement that's been clearly violated by this organization? And will the state pick up on it? Like, the $400,000 that they've received, have they fulfilled what that grant was issued by the state? Because I know in our conversation, you said we may have to cover that cost at the same time, and that's very discouraging. And the also other thing, and I don't want to get the board involved on this, but when they purchase designs have a stamp that are only good for so long. So if the money wasn't coming in to balance out actually breaking ground, why would we have built, why would they paid for designs that would have been out of term, out of zoning, and out of use by the time they were knowing that they were going to build when it wasn't there? A picture could have been fine, but actual design is sealed and ready to go. So and we should find out if there's any, what was that decision? But lastly, I would agree. I hope Comptroller Diamond gets involved in an audit with this. I think that not only we want to know, the public wants to know, the families want to know. Everyone wants to know what has happened. This organization was established less than a month after the tragedy, and here we are 7.5 years later, and we don't really know anything internally besides what's been given out. And I think that for us, just financially, do they even have enough money to pay us back? But where we stand to go forward, and how, at the end of this, how do we make this right? How do we actually do something for this family and take control of this and move forward on this museum and doing something that's right after all of this that's been mishandled? So I look forward. I hope you start getting responses on these letters that have gone out. I hope they start, acting and we get all the information demanded, because it's a bad feeling today, but I'm thankful for you guys moving us forward. Instead of us still wondering, you guys have done the steps to move forward. But I hope, Comptroller, you will really exercise that right as the guy who checks and balances everything and looks at that, and we'll review this.
Well, and thank you for that. We'll see what we get from the foundation. We'll take a look at that. But keeping in mind two things, of course. One is where the audit authority goes, which is just on the amounts the county paid. And I know you raised some larger questions about the entire organization, and our scope is just what did the county write the checks for, if you will. And then I think the other question, which maybe we haven't talked about as much, is typically when we do audits, we do them with ongoing organizations where there will be corrections that can be made going forward, improvements. And unfortunately, what we hear about the foundation today is, unlike when we do an audit of a county agency and we say, well, if you do this better, if you do better testing of drivers that have to have commercial driver's licenses, that benefits public safety. That's important for so many reasons. And that's something that, using that example, the HR department has improved going forward, and as a result, we have better public safety. So that's the other thing we have to balance when we consider where do we do that, where do we audit, and what the benefits are, what can we hope to see as a result, what positive changes can we see, because that's, at the end of the day, what our goal is.
All right, Commissioner Wilson.
Yeah, I think following up on that, maybe, Comptroller, the answer to that part of the question is that it helps inform us, right? We're ultimately, once again, talking about TDT investment and about the way that we can ensure that we are being as diligent and as consistent as possible in those types of investments, understanding the delicacy of this particular investment. There's no question, we need to do what's right at this point. But I do think that in moving forward, we have to look back. We have to figure out where there may have been some initial investments that if they were missteps, it's at this point, what do we do next? And how do we learn from that to those pieces of information that will be forthcoming? My question, and I'm not even sure who would be able to answer this because I wasn't here back, well, I was here in the area, and like you all, I think we all can remember every moment of that 24 hours. But the decisions moving forward as far as the support from the county's TDT to a particular nonprofit as opposed to, we have a world-class history museum here, and Pam Schwartz is an unbelievable resource as a director. And we went on the one-year anniversary, my family did, to the Pulse Memorial that they did at the Orange County History Museum. And it was an unbelievably well-done, moving, archival history exhibit. And, these are investments that we've already made. Our history museum is an investment we've already made, and Pam Schwartz and her team do an incredible job archiving the history of this area. They've won awards for what they've done with the Ocoee Massacre, and the reverence that they gave, I believe, in some of the artifacts and pieces that need to be preserved for generations to come, gave me the sense that they understood the historical relevance. And so I was wondering, understanding that we have to really, I know the legal part of this is going to continue to be an entanglement, right? And the real estate portion of this is its own category. But if we look towards our obligation as leaders in understanding if we continue to invest in something that is the right thing to do to memorialize this tragedy, can we go to the people we know in our organization that are experts? Can we bring in Pam Schwartz and find out, when she put that together at the 1 year, how she worked with the foundation or with the family members, or in order to be able to regroup and move forward with an investment? My question for Whitney is, and maybe Mindy's got this too, I'm not sure, understanding our agreement was for funds, TDT funds, for the acquisition of a piece of property that would then be a museum. How does that interact with what the city's obligations are right now and what they just made a decision to do?
So there isn't much interaction. If I'm understanding your question, Commissioner, the city owns the memorial site where the actual nightclub was, where the disaster was. That is separate and apart from our agreement for the museum. I think there was some overlap there in their state grant agreement. That was initially for the memorial and the museum. As far as I know, for those two, that is the only overlap legally that we have in terms of the contract.
I think what she's getting at is that the TDT dollars could only have been used to build a museum, not a memorial site. And so that's where the distinction is. And so where the city of Orlando is at this point is they're focused on the memorial site. And there's different schools of thought from family members and other interested parties in our community about the museum. That was somewhat controversial. Some people thought that was commercializing the tragedy, and they were in opposition to a museum. And there were others who thought, no, this is an opportunity to tell the story for the future, to preserve the history, et cetera. So that's the distinction.
Thank you. That's really helpful. My last 2 cents here is, moving forward, obviously this is going to be pretty intensive, and I know there's going to be a lot of information coming in, and we may not be on the forefront, but if you could just keep the commissioners apprised as things move forward. Unfortunately, as these things happened recently, we found out to some extent when news broke, and that's difficult, knowing that we are the stewards of public funds in some of these, and we really want to do the right things moving forward. So I appreciate if we can kind of keep that dialogue up.
Absolutely.
Commissioner Gomez-Cordero.
Thank you, Mayor. I have to say that every time we talk about this topic on this day, it really hurts and it hurts and it hurts. Like it was yesterday. Mostly that the night that happens, it was a Latino night. And a big number of these victims were Puerto Rican. So it hurts every time. And still, as a counselor, mental health counselor, I still have contact with some of these parents and mom that every year, suffer the same tragedy that happens that day. But saying that, now we are trying to do a good thing, and now we are here with this big mess because everything that involves money is a mess. And I just was thinking that knowing that Orange County is so strict with all of this money going back and forth or whatever, and we are at this point right now, right, that maybe we won't be able to do the museum because of money. I just have a few questions. Was anyone from Orange County part of the foundation board?
Not that I'm aware of, but do you?
No one? Okay.
I'm looking to the foundation folks. I don't believe so.
No? Okay, and like Vice President of the foundation said that, in the beginning people were emotional and everybody was like, yeah, but this is not about emotion, this is about money, and now we are here. If this doesn't go through, this building that was already bought for $3.5 million, who it belongs to?
Say that again. If what doesn't go through?
The building that was bought for $3.5 million, if this museum doesn't go through, this building will belong to who?
So under the agreement, the building will come back to the county. They'll convey it back to the county.
To Orange County.
Correct.
Okay, so
Building.
since it was bought with TDT money, what exactly can be done there? How can it be used when it come back to Orange County? Do we know?
Ultimately, that's going to be a decision for the board. I think we don't have the information we need yet at this point to determine what we're going to do with that. If you want to use it for a museum, it can still be used for a museum. That is a TDT eligible project. As the mayor said, it could not be used for a memorial. You cannot use TDT funds for that. I think, again, ultimately, we're going to have to get through the process that we outlined today to understand where we are with the building, what the value is. The board will then need to decide whether or not you want to keep the building and use it for something else, or whether you want to sell the building and take those funds to, in the unfortunate event that we have to repay the state grant, use some of those funds for that, put the rest of it back into TDT. That's a decision that's going to need to be made in the future, so we don't really have a lot of answers on that right now.
Thank you, Whitney. Whitney, and my other question is, I know we were briefed yesterday on this, and you said about the 500,000 grants, and they were already used 300,000?
400,000.
400. For what it was used? Because if that's not going through, we still have to go and pay back the 500.
So, Commissioner, you know what I can do, if this is helpful for you all? Miles, can you put up the overhead for a second? Under that state grant agreement, they were given a line item budget for what they could use the $500,000 for. One of the amendments, the first amendment that went through in 2020, was to actually amend that line item budget. So what I'm putting on the screen, what Miles is putting on the screen for me, thank you, is that shows you the top columns are what the initial budget line items were. The bottom part is what they amended it to. So it was for executive director salary, hazmat removal, because as we understand it, there was some asbestos in the building, demolition of the warehouse, demolition of asphalt, and then conceptual designs. And you can see at the bottom how those numbers shifted in the amendment.
Okay. Okay, I think, thank you, Whitney, for this. I think, Controller, I'm with my colleagues about, doing an audit and so, just because I know that people want to know, the families want to know, and we want to know where we're going to go with this. It's true, what Commissioner Wilson is saying, I mean, where we go from here, how we can do it right, how we can, I don't know, take something positive from all of this. So those are my questions for now, Whitney. I know I have more, so I'm going to get with you later. So, and thank you for the opportunity, Mayor.
Let me just go to the county attorney, Mr. Newton. Was there anything else that you wanted to jump in with?
No, Mayor, that cue was from earlier time, and the question that came up.
All right, Commissioner Scott.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Chairman, would you mind coming back forward to the podium, please? You don't have to get really detailed, but if you could just kind of surmise. What conversation or what board meetings led to the decision to dissolve the nonprofit? Was it done over a series of meetings and one meeting too? Can you kind of share or surmise how you guys came to the decision to dissolve the foundation?
I think once the city made the decision to purchase the site and build the memorial, it was clear that funding for anything else was going to be impossible. And because the negative media was, not helping anybody wanting to give money to us. So in just looking at the financials, we took the decision last week to dissolve.
You have a timeline for that dissolution?
We met with council yesterday, and, it's a process. It will take several months.
This is like salt in an open wound. Obviously, as the comptroller is stated, there are things we can ask for legally and other things that are kind of outside the scope of our purview. I would just ask more of you and your colleagues. I know you guys have already given a significant amount of your time in being able to articulate like the nuances and things that might not be ordinarily apparent to the outside eye. There is perspectives in some of the decisions that you all as a board made and did not make. And so just really just speaking to those perspectives, the nuances, why things did or did not occur. I do not have I don't have a judgment as to, what went wrong or what went right, but I think that it's important that we understand very intimately what led to the decisions that have been made over the years that got us to this point, so that those decisions don't reoccur, so that there are safeguards in place. This is really like salt in the open room. I can't even begin to explain how overwhelming this is for me. I used to go to Pulse. I woke up that morning with my mom and my dad, a number of missed calls thinking that I was there. I lost friends. I had several friends that were hurt. So this is, it's a lot to process. And so if I feel this way and I was not there, I can only imagine how the mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters feel. And so I am just asking, as we start to go through this process, to ask questions of you and your colleagues, that you try to share as much as you're able to, so that we get to a point where we move forward. I would ask that when you talk with your legal counsel, that you consider in some fashion maybe leaving the organization in hold, and maybe I don't know, changing the board or different things. But we have to get to a point where we make a decision that not memorializes tragedy, but just celebrates the hallmarks of the individuals who's lost their lives. You know, one of them being my friends who was a service member. And so I thank you and your colleagues for the work that you've done. I'm sure there's a lot more work ahead of you. I certainly thank you for coming here this morning because you're under no obligation to be here or stay here and answer the questions. And so I'm grateful for the time that you have given in service of others. But we need to get to a point where we move forward. And I'm not sure what that looks like, but I know it's going to be done in concert with questions from you. And so as the comptroller and his staff begins to ask questions and things like that, think about things that you can share that can just give perspective, because this is incredibly overwhelming. It is frustrating. Again, I just can't even begin to describe how frustrating it is just to see this over the years. And so, again, I thank you and your colleagues for the work that you've done. And I ask that, you know, you just do your best to kind of help us through this process so that we figure out what occurred, why it occurred, and what we can do to mitigate it from occurring in the future, and so that we can get to a point where we honor the people that lost their lives, the first responders who are still recovering mentally from the things that they witnessed, because this isn't representative of the community that I've lived my entire life, and I know we have to get to a point where we move forward. So thank you sincerely for the work that you've done, and I appreciate you and your time.
And George, I know a lot of people ask you this question, but now that we are where we are, is there anything that perhaps you feel that you would have done differently? Being able to look back at everything that has happened at this point, what would you have done differently as a board, if anything?
Yeah. I think what I'm sure you all know, and anytime, I think what we've learned, and we heard this, to be honest, when we met in Oklahoma City, the 9/11, Shanksville, anytime it's an event or a project is based on a tragedy such as this, it becomes very difficult to reach any type of consensus, just because people are all over the place. And that clearly is the situation here. So on one hand, I felt like we were involving people, families, as I said, survivors, everybody. But it's clear that the group that felt differently was not part of who we were talking to. And I think a lot of that comes because, as Yolanda said, we're a group of volunteers. We're meeting once a quarter. So, you know, you hire an executive director, and the executive director makes sure everything goes well. Again, the audit, or however you choose to move forward, will show the truth. I'm quite confident, as I stand here today, that procedurally you're going to find everything was clean, very clean. Our CFO is tougher than the people I've had to work with in my career. So I feel good about that. The difficult part is going to be the emotional and subjective opportunities when somebody feels this should be this way, this should be that way. And it's tough. Those are just very tough questions. We started, there's a point of view, as you know, that we didn't focus on the memorial. I would argue within a year we had an interim memorial in place. So it's not like we didn't do anything. We did. But when you receive a grant for a museum and you have 7 years to build it, you have to get going on that. And then what we found is actually the thing that most people wanted to give toward was scholarships. So when you see the amount of money that we brought in, you're going to see millions that went to scholarships. Almost 200 young people received scholarships. And so, those are things that, it wasn't part of a memorial, it wasn't part of a museum, but it was part of what we did, and I think something that benefited the community. So, stepping back, maybe we would have had a little, the governance was good, the board, spectacular, the committees, the best in the area. I mean, you had a lot of people who were very, very concerned and involved. I just think it's a tough emotional one. And then, obviously, the sale of the property in this last year, that whole issue and not being able to have the site, it was clear from the family's perspective that it needed to be on the site. And we tried, and what you will see in the expenditure, we tried to build a memorial adjacent because it was clear that we weren't going to get the property, but then the families didn't want that. And this is an iterative process that goes on. And, fortunately now I'm happy that there will be something on the site because that's clearly what the families want. And it's what we wanted all along. It's just we couldn't get there. And the city was able to do that. So.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Bonilla.
I have a question as well. Yeah. There have been some great questions being asked, by the way. So my question for you, you were saying that you couldn't get the Pulse building. Why not?
Because they wouldn't sell it to it. They wouldn't donate it. And as we
So
were
who's
trying.
they? Who owned the
The
building?
Pomas.
Huh?
The Pomas.
Barbara Poma?
Are you talking about the nightclub site?
Yes.
Yes.
And she was the executive director of the foundation.
That's correct.
Okay, so she owned the building, and the foundation wanted the building that she owned, but they couldn't, foundation couldn't
We
get.
asked for it to be donated, and they
Donated.
said no, because we were not able to raise funds. People, when they would donate, would say, I will donate, but I don't want to donate if it's going to go to purchase the land, because I believe that she should donate it. So we-
Okay, so the foundation wanted it donated, not paid for.
Correct,
And that was the board, of course, making that decision.
correct. Yes.
So the money, though, that you got from the county for TDT, that couldn't be used to.
It could have, no,
No, why not?
because it's in the
It's a
statutes.
memorial site.
Okay. Because that was a memorial? But if you're going to turn it into a museum, though?
The museum, so this was always part of the challenge. Physically, the museum had to be somewhere else.
Okay.
So the museum is at Cayley and Division, the memorial on Orange and Esther at the site. And so we couldn't use any of the funds from the TDT grant toward the memorial.
Even if the memorial is going to be turned into a museum?
What?
So what I'm saying is that if you were going to use the TDT to purchase the building to turn it into a museum, would that have been allowed?
I guess maybe it would have been.
I guess.
Commissioner, tourist development tax dollars can be utilized for purposes of constructing a museum. There was a determination quite some time ago with respect to a memorial, I believe it was a Veterans Memorial or Service Memorial that Orange County had located at its convention center, and that subsequently it was relocated to the Orange County Court facility. And the determination was made by, or at least an opinion was issued by the Attorney General, which effectively indicated that tourist development tax proceeds could not be used for a memorial unless that memorial was determined to be constructed and attract tourism. And that was not the case, as I understand, with respect to the Pulse Memorial.
Okay, and there's another thing in the statutes too. Was it that they had constructed the museum, but you can't, where you're not allowed to
You
buy a
got-
building to turn it
No,
into?
it's construct, it's
It's
acquire, it's a
constructed.
bunch of verbs that are
Yeah.
utilized in the statute.
Okay,
And Commissioner, just to clarify, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The nightclub site was the site where they were trying to build a memorial. There's a separate location at 438 West Cayley, which is what they purchased to actually build the museum. So they weren't trying
No,
to
I
turn.
understand that.
Okay,
I
I thought you were saying
understand
they were
that.
trying to turn the memorial
No,
into a
I was
museum.
just
Okay,
wondering if that had ever been an option.
gotcha.
Yeah. And I'm guessing no, because you have to construct. You can't buy a building already in existence.
You can buy a building already in existence.
Okay,
However, the building you're buying in existence that you're going to renovate, let's say renovate into a museum, is an appropriate expense under the tourist development tax statute. However, a memorial is not a eligible expense under the tourist development tax statute.
I understand that, okay, thank you. And now the city is purchasing that building,
Correct.
and are they going to turn it into a museum too, or just a memorial?
I'm not sure of their plans.
No?
So far, they've indicated, because of the wishes of the families wanting it to be a memorial site,
Okay.
and the city has acquired the property to be a memorial site,
Okay,
not a
thank you.
museum.
Okay, so in that case, I agree that there's no reason to pursue the museum. All right, just wanted to clarify that. All right, I'm thinking I have no more. Well, I do have one more question, but I don't know if I should ask it. And because I want to be very sensitive, you know, it is a sensitive topic, there's lots of emotions in it. Try not even to cry, like, it's one of those moments where it's like 9/11, you remember where you were, like, this is one of those moments too. It was, you know, getting that call in the middle of the night and just like, yeah, it was a tough night. But, so I don't want to be disrespectful, but I'm just wondering, like, we were looking at that overhead, and the executive salary was doubled. And then I'm looking at this information here, where in, I think the last year maybe it was, where it went up to almost $250,000 for salary. So, I mean, it was,
Right. What happened, first of all, the salary is very much in line with the revenue of a nonprofit. We studied that. So I feel confident that if you look at the data, it will support that. During COVID, the executive director took half a salary. And so we applied for a COVID relief loan, which we did receive, which was only to be used for salaries. So everybody took half salary, everybody got that back. However, it showed up in the next year. And so that's why it looks like the salary jumped. But in fact, it was just a payment from the previous year.
okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Dan, I'm hearing, but that's a lot of money. Thank you. But I definitely will say that what I'm seeing from this nonprofit isn't any different than any other nonprofit in how they've operated, and the transparency. I know, like the comptroller said, we only look at the money that we give them and how that's used, not any other funds that they receive. And this is the same with any other organization we work with as well, including Visit Orlando. The donations that they collect outside of what we give them, we don't see where that money goes. We don't know where that money goes. I'd like to know. That's one of the things. So, you know, this definitely, I feel, is a learning experience for us as well, that, you know, perhaps we could consider, you know, in our contracts with nonprofits, asking for a little bit more transparency, more information, because we don't know how they're really operating, you know, outside of what we're giving them or the contracts. And I know that, you know, this one in particular, I mean, like I said, it's functioning the way any other nonprofit works, but because of this situation and the emotion behind it and the negative media, I mean, they're just out there and everyone's seeing it. Other nonprofits, they're not in the media. They're not seeing that they're operating basically the same way. I mean, I know some nonprofits that we've given money to where the executive directors like doubled their salary. So it's been happening with nonprofits out there that we're giving money to. They get donations from other sources too, though, not just from us. So, definitely a learning lesson, and, it's hard. I know 9/11, I've been back to New York, since then. It hit me hard, 9/11, because I was, in New York. I was born in New York, and, when I went back to visit New York, I still couldn't go back. I couldn't go to the site, That's just me personally, though I, couldn't. But, yeah, definitely some learning lessons here and some great questions that were asked. And I am looking forward to see how we move forward. Thank you. Thanks.
So, Mr. Caligari, just, one of the best practices with nonprofits is to have audits, have audits done of your books. What are audits done, published audits?
Every year.
Over time. And so those audits
Are available.
certainly can be made available to the public as well. And generally, all of the organizations that we provide funding to, just one of the things that we look for are their audits that's done independent of what the comptroller may do, but
Right.
the audits that where some certified public accounting firm goes in and says that, yes, they are doing business consistent with their policies, procedures, best practices, and the law.
Correct.
As well. So it sounds
have
like you
those,
have
yes.
that in place.
Yes.
Okay. All right. With that, Commissioner Uribe, final questions or thoughts?
I'm sitting here when you told us about the property on Orange Avenue and how you guys couldn't get it donated, yet your executive director is the owner of said property. I mean, I'm so sorry, but this seems like such a major conflict. I mean, can you tell me how you're talking to the family who owns the property and they're like, no, we're not going to give it to you? I remember seeing an interview recently where an investor was saying, look, I'm just an investor. I don't have anything to do with anything. But how did that transpire? Don't you think that was a conflict when you guys made her your executive director? So she owns the property, profited from the property, and now she's making decisions to not assist the organization that she's leading.
Well, at the time that the discussion for donating was taking place, she had already left the organization.
So all these years, you guys never talked about actually using that property as a memorial or a museum?
We did, and the goal was to purchase it for $2 million, which was what the city had offered to purchase it for in 2016. And as we tried to raise money, we kept getting pushback because people did not feel that we should use that money to purchase the land from her, from the owners. And so that's when we said, we're going to ask if they would donate it, because it was clear us trying to raise money to build anything was running into a standstill regarding the memorial if the money was going to go toward buying the land, but we needed to buy the land before we could do anything. So it was like you couldn't get there from here. So that's why we said, would you donate it? And we were not able to reach an agreement on that.
Okay, I'm so sorry. It just seems like such a conflict of interest when you're discussing this and you're explaining to us, we couldn't buy it, she wouldn't donate it. Oh, by the way, she's our executive director who's making money off of this entire nonprofit, and I'm just seeing like red flags. Secondly, you discussed, getting a lot of scholarships. And while I have been to many of the beautiful events over the years as we celebrate and you give out these scholarships, again, when you're doing development and you had staff that did development, how were we not able to target and do what needed to be done? Yes, we appreciate you wanting to give a scholarship. I don't even know how that conversation would go. But our mission is to build a museum it just doesn't quite sound right, and it doesn't quite go along, but yet, and I trust that you and the board were in good faith when you served on this board, and I trust that none of you were compensated for being on the board. It was a volunteer board?
That is correct.
Okay. But but you all are, are professionals, and this isn't the first board you've ever served on. I mean, it just seems like there were a lot of things that came in front of you that just didn't quite add up. I'm not saying that there was any malicious done, but just serious conflict of interest when you're doing this, because at the end of the day, your passion to serve was to serve all of those victims and their families. And it's so sad for us to get here and to hear this conversation. I really didn't want to press my button again, but I'm like, wait a minute, did I just hear what she asked? The woman who ran the organization owned the property. I mean, and then her family owned the club where all these individuals passed away. So they made profit way over the years at this organization and didn't see fit to even donate it. I just think that should have been a clear, you shouldn't be running an organization where you're not even willing to give to it yourself, knowing that this is where the tragedy happened. And that's major. And then, and with all the staff, what was the staff for? Were they out there to raise money? Were these development folks?
You had development folks, you had scholarship, you had finance, publicity. But again, I think at the height, it was 14. This is not a big staff in a nonprofit.
But I mean, to be 14, but not to be able to accomplish the goal is where it's discerning, because.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
I couldn't
and
agree more.
I just want to say, Comptroller, thank you for trying to take this on. I understand when you do audits, you give us reports on what needs to be fixed, and Mr. Brooks has the pleasure of responding on how we get those things done. But I think for the public, for these families, if we can't do it, we should ask the state to look into this. We should ask the IRS to look into this, because there has to be some accountability of the millions of dollars over all these years that have been spent. And I think at the end of the day, I know it's hard to dissolve a nonprofit because you guys got in it, but I think it's the right thing to do to give back the dignity and allow something fresh to take over. But I also think that we can't do a memorial, but we should look at a Holtz Memorial Museum. I mean, is it about the words? Because we know people come from all over the world to see this memorial that's there right now. We know, I remember one time I drove by and the First Lady was there. I know Ricky Martin was there. He took pictures there. I mean, people come from the world to see this. And when you think of that, those are tourist development tax dollars, and we need to do what's right. That's what I need to do right. But it's just frustrating to hear, and I know that you guys had to make a conscious decision. And again, I'm thankful that you showed up here and saw us firsthand, but you saw the emotion on this
Sure.
board. We all just think of what ultimately happened that night and how do we make this right. But I got to tell you, I mean, I don't know if you're capable of, but your books should be completely open and transparent. Where you spent money over the last years, when you hired 8 people or 18 people to go raise money, how much did they raise? These questions are, any organization, any business should be able to say, well, these 18 people raised 10 million a year, and yet we spent 18 million a year. So clearly, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. And I think for the public and for what's left, and as you dissolve this, you guys should offer those. I trust that your CFO was very, very confident in what he did, but try not to make us go chase this. I mean, let us see what's there. Let us see what's happened. Let us see what we can fix, and let us see what we can try to do to move forward. So thank you again for your service. Thank you for standing here. But my goodness, when you spoke, it's just more frustrating than not to hear some of these things that we weren't aware of, the details of that. And thank you, Commissioner Bonilla. I understood where she was going. It was like emotion, but it was like, wait a minute, this doesn't quite add up. So I hope that you guys will consider doing that, since Comptroller is limited. Let us see what's been spent and why and how and what's been brought in.
Okay. Thank you all for your presence. With that, we're going to conclude this item on the agenda this morning and move forward to the next item. We will, of course, at appropriate times, come back to the board with some updates on developments as they occur. And to that, we'll move forward to the next item on our agenda this